omniscience and what God knows and doesn't know. So let me just, I guess, lead off with that, which is God knew about the dude on the roof when the Secret Service ignored it. Okay, and you know, I see these images. I said I was done. I guess I'm not. But I see these images on Facebook. One of them, I mean, it's really an inspiring image, but it's like it's a drawing of Trump sort of standing at the podium with his head turned, and then it's like you got this outline or whatever that I guess is supposed to be an angel or Jesus or something with their hand right by his head where the bullet went. And you know, that's a really nice sentiment, but what I would say is the direction of that bullet was ordained from before the foundation of the world. Okay, it's not that somebody had to go stop it right then, because that's already been factored, which I think is honestly more awe-inspiring than if God had to react on the spot, right? Okay, I really am done now, I promise. Yeah. We know who we serve and we know who He is, and so that's right. All right, so we have been talking about God's omniscience, what it is that God knows, how He knows it, why He knows it, and the short answer to that is, well, He is truth. He is the things that we try to be, God already is. He is the substance of all of those things. He is the source of all of those things. That includes knowledge. God's not learning anything. Nobody's telling God something He didn't already know. He knows it. He ordained it, as we've talked about. It's already factored into the plan. You know, there's none of this business about, this is not even, I'm already going away from my notes. This is going to be good. So there's a branch of theology. You probably will never, ever hear anybody use this term, but I'm going to give it to you anyway in case you get curious. There's a brand of theology that's called process theology. Can't talk and spell. And process theologians say that God is always becoming just like we are always becoming. And so they read those passages in the Bible where it says that God repented of His wrath, or that God was sorry for what He had done, or whatever like that. And they read those as God recognizing, I shouldn't have done that. In order to be a good God, I should have done something differently, or I need to do something differently, so I'm going to back off and I'm going to, you know, back up and punt and try again, kind of thing. That's a really prominent kind of thinking. You know, pure process theology is very much, you know, God as a wheel in the machine kind of thing, and that as technology advances, you know, we change how machines operate, and that's sort of the way that God is viewed, is that as time goes on and as God learns more, sort of the way that He operates changes, which is not true. We know that's not true. What I will say about that way of thinking is we sometimes, maybe even because of our best angels, but sometimes we think that God's opinion about issues changes. And so the way that He deals with those issues changes. So, you know, I don't want to get off on this too much, but something like the LGBTQ issues in the world. How long has the church maintained that God's design was one man, one woman, it's foundational in creation, and therefore to suggest that anything else is okay with God is sort of to slap God in the face with what He ordained at the beginning, right? I mean, that has been the standard line of the church for ever, literally. Then we come kind of into the modern era, and you begin to see people say, well, but maybe that's the way they interpreted it, but God didn't intend it to be that way forever. Maybe that was a cultural issue, and it really doesn't apply now that we're here. And so you kind of get a little bit of that process thinking going on, where time has gone on, civilization has developed, we have more knowledge, and because we have more knowledge, God changes. No, He hasn't changed. We need to be aware that we don't know what He knows, and our knowledge should be conditioned by His perfect knowledge, not His perfect knowledge conditioned by our imperfect knowledge. So that is just one sort of, that's a freebie. You can do with that what you want or not. But we looked at some scriptural evidence for some of this stuff, and we left off over in Isaiah where God is telling those pagan folks, if your gods are all that in a bucket of chicken, then they're going to be able to tell you about the future. They're going to be able to tell you about something that happened in the past and explain to you its implications for the future that we haven't seen yet. And he hangs his deity on whether or not the pagan gods can do that. Of course, he knows that they can't, but this is not proving anything to him, it's proving it to them, right? And so, over and over again, and I think this may even be an element of the Bible that we miss, but part of the importance of prophecy is not because we're supposed to get hung up in trying to interpret it. It's because we're supposed to recognize that we don't know, that God is the only one who knows, that God is powerful enough to say, hey, this is going to happen, and then, as some cases in the Bible, we see the fulfillment of that, such as the Isaiah prophecy about Jesus, fast forward, then you get Jesus born of a virgin, right? Who could have come up with that on their own? Nobody, right? Even in the Psalms, it's the 22nd Psalm. It's sort of an amazing emotional, mental run-through of the crucifixion. Well, who would have come up with that? All those thousands of years before. Nobody, right? And so, the point of prophecy, at least partly, the point of prophecy in the Bible is that it establishes God's power as one who knows and has authority over what he knows. Because it's not even just that we can say, I'm sure we've all been in these situations before where somebody tells you they're going to do something and you can absolutely know it's going to go south real quick, and you even know how it's going to go south. And you tell them about it and they're like, nah, I'm going to do it anyway. And then it goes south and then they're like, gee, I wish I'd have known. And you're like, told you. Ray Charles could have seen that. Well, it's kind of we don't have authority over the future in those situations. We can see it, we can know what's going to happen, but we can't do anything about it. All we can try to do is convince Mr. Bobby not to do that next week, but if he decides to do it, that's where our power stops, right? Well, God is not that way. God has authority over the future. That's right. But God is not like that. God is like, that's going to happen in the future and I'm in control of it. I didn't miss it. Nobody had to tell me about it. I've already seen it and it's part of the plan. So, you going to trust me or not?
We see a lot of things coming. We try to prevent them if we possibly can.
Right. So, we can shove all of this thinking kind of over, and we mentioned this last week, over into the New Testament and think about the person of Jesus. Jesus also operates in that capacity as prophet, to the degree that at the Last Supper he's saying, Judas is going to betray me, but I think sort of the more subtle one is, Peter's also going to deny me 3 times. And Peter, oh no, I'm not going to do that, whatever like that. To the degree that Peter is in the middle of doing this and realizes only after he's denied him the 3rd time, duh, he told me I was going to do this, and here I go. So, even if you want to think about authority in that way, Jesus said it was going to happen, it happened, Peter just did it, because that was who Peter was. It's not that anybody forced Peter to do that, it's that that's who Peter was.
I think he also told Judas he was going to be the one.
Well, he does. Right.
Judas agreed to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we have that sort of affirmation of God's foreknowledge. And then, I have sort of beaten this drum to death, but I'll say it again. God can't learn anything. Romans 11:33 to 36, Paul says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen." That was Romans 11:33 to 36. I mean, Paul is again going at and extolling the unsearchable depths of God's knowledge and understanding. And he's quoting the psalm there, "For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor?" Has any of you been bold enough to go tell God, "Hey God, I don't think you know this. In case you missed it." No. And then I like the second half of that, which really doesn't have anything to do with his knowledge necessarily, but who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid. "Oh, I did something so great for you today, God. Will you please bless me accordingly?" You don't want to be blessed accordingly, folks.
A lot of people think that they do something like that, they should be more rewarded by God.
Yeah, you don't want to get what you deserve, trust me. And so...
It all kind of boils down to good and the bad, like
yeah.
You don't want to call it that way, you know.
And this is free, you don't have to turn there, but Job 21:22 asks, "Will any teach God knowledge, seeing that he judges those that are on high?" And of course the implication is no, they're not going to teach God anything, because he already has knowledge that is perfect. So, I mean, what we have in the Bible is this overwhelming establishment of God's astonishing intellectual powers. I mean, it goes beyond anything any of us could ever approximate, and there have been some real smart people. Great discoveries have been made, but those people who are making those discoveries have made them for us, not for God. I mean, when Watson and Crick come up with DNA, it's not because it was news to God that that's how he created people. That's because they should have learned something new about God. So he has this immeasurable, perfect knowledge that he can't learn anything because he is perfect in knowledge. Right? Any questions about any of that before we jump off into giant puddle that I'm not sure I'm ready for, but we're going to try it. Courtney says, "Bring it on." I feel like sometimes I'm like, Courtney just wants me to answer the hard questions just to see how deep I'll go. But Courtney and Josh. But, all right. So, go, if you will, to 1 Samuel 23. 1 Samuel 23. So, as we've been thinking about God and what God knows, part of our way of thinking, or all of our way of thinking, has been God knows everything about everything. He knows everything about everybody. He knows past, present, and future. But the one that we really haven't messed with yet, and perhaps we should have just left it alone, but is God knows what would happen even under different circumstances. Which is a kind of knowledge that we don't necessarily have. I mean, again, we have those moments where we think, well, if so-and-so had handled that in this way, the outcome would have been this, but we don't know that. That's what we think based on knowing personalities, knowing situations, whatever. And I think we're particularly good at that with our parents, probably. We know how they tick and how they think, and so, as maybe not as kids, but as adults, when we're trying to deal with them, we can look at somebody and we can say, you can try that, but that's not going to work. You're not going to get very far with them like that. If you want them to hear you, you need to approach it this way, right? God has that supersized, because he recognizes, and I think this is, and this is why I say this is a giant puddle in some sense. God knows every situation, every circumstance, every person, every idea, whatever else, to such a degree that he knows what would happen if the plan were different. I guess is a way to say that. So rather than try to explain that anymore, I want us to read through this. 1 Samuel 23, verses 1 to 13. Now they told David, "Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors." Therefore David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" And the Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, "Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. Now when Abiathar the son of Ahimelech had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, "God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars." And Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him. And he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod here." Then David said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will come down." Then David said, "Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul?" And the Lord said, "They will surrender you." Then David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. So, you had Abiathar coming down here. David's being chased by Saul. This is, a big part of David's story. And Abiathar comes down, and he has what is effectively a divining rod kind of thing. And this instrument, however they were using it, sort of gives them the idea that Saul's coming and he's going to get David, and that's going to be the end of that. Saul, however, does not come down to Keilah, so the men of Keilah do not surrender David over to Saul. The way that I think we can probably think of an ephod, just kind of to give us a frame of reference, is it's sort of like a magic 8-ball where the only two answers are yes or no. Is this going to happen? Yes. Is this going to happen? No. Should I do this? Should I not do that? Those kinds of questions are what that would have been used for. And so it answered in such a way that it told David what would happen if David were to remain in the city. And so the deal here is, if he were to remain, then Saul would come down, and if he were to come down and attack the city, then the men of Keilah are going to deliver David over to him. This is an example of where God knew what would happen, that Saul will not come down, but he knew what would happen under different circumstances. So this is a case in the Bible where the circumstances, how can I best say this? The circumstances did not eventuate the outcome. So, let's say it this way: if David were to remain at Keilah, Saul would come down. The premise is wrong there. David did not remain at Keilah. So what we're talking about here, and this is put on your philosophy hat, and I'm sorry, forget about that. What we're talking about here is this idea of God knowing counterfactuals. Okay? A counterfactual is a conditional statement with a false antecedent. Okay, now I'm using English words, sorry. But think about the phrase, if I were you, I would do X, Y, or Z. Okay? The false antecedent which is that phrase in the beginning, if I were you. I'm not you. There's not a world where I will ever be you. So already the statement is beginning with this false antecedent. And the rest of the sentence is conditioned on whether or not that false antecedent is true. So if I were you, I'd go to Hattiesburg this afternoon. Well, I'm not you. And even if you go to Hattiesburg this afternoon, it's not because I went to Hattiesburg. It's because you went there. Okay? Everybody has a trip when you go over there.
I'm looking for a board house. I'm in the Dixie area right now. That's no man's land. And there's gold in a circle. I don't give up. I'll keep home.
John Bonet lives in Dixie, and I go down 2 roads because that's all I can make sense of. But here's another one. If I was rich, I'd buy a Mercedes. Well, I'm not rich, so I'm not going to buy a Mercedes. Now, if I ever do become rich, might I buy a Mercedes? Perhaps. But at the moment I said that, I wasn't rich. So it's a false antecedent. It's a counterfactual statement. It runs against the facts of the circumstances. So here's another example. I'm just going to read it. Again, you don't have to turn there, but I'm going to be over in John 21 for just a second. One verse here. John 21 verse 6. Of course, this is the resurrection chapter in John's Gospel. Sorry, 21, not 20. I went to the wrong place. Jesus appearing to the 7, rather. And so I'm going to read verses 5 and 6, but I'm going to focus in on 6. Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" And they answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. What did Jesus know here? He knew that if they were to cast the net on the right side of the boat, then they would have a great catch. So he tells them, do it, cast it on the right side, you will get a great catch. Because if he knew that they were to do it, then they would catch these fish. So in this particular case, they obeyed his command, so it's not a counterfactual. The counterfactual there would be they're casting their net on the left side of the boat. Jesus tells them, do it over here and you'll have a great catch. They don't know that they're going to have a great catch until they do it. Their knowledge, the facts of their situation is we've been out here fishing all night, we've been casting our nets and not catching anything.
And I don't care how the Lord tell you to do things, everybody somewhere along the line, they're going to cast a little bit of their own salt in the game. They're going to do it there, a little bit of their own, a little bit of the Lord.
So that was a counterfactual that doesn't have a false antecedent. Because every bit of it is true. If you cast your net on the right side of the boat, you're going to catch all of these fish. We use these in decision making all the time. You're sitting at an intersection and you say, if I were to pull out now, I would make it. Versus, if I pull out now, I'm going to get hit. Right? I mean, there's a chance maybe that if you pull out and you think you're going to get hit, you might not. But most likely you're going to. I mean, there are just certain times when that's stupid, right? And we have sort of, yeah. Or, I mean, you can think about it in any little decision. Like, Brother Tommy may sit there, and if I pick up that Yeti cup by the lid, the bottom's going to fall off of it. It probably will. I mean, you don't know that 100%, but probably will, because that just would be my luck anyway. If I were you, that's what would happen to me. But another one, and this is stupid, but have it. If I were to quit smoking, my breath would smell better. So I decided to quit smoking. The antecedent's true. If you're not smoking, your breath does smell better. So there are these sort of what we're going to call within these counterfactuals subjunctive conditionals. I'm so sorry. You did not ask to get the English professor. You asked to get the Bible teacher. Is it? Okay. So, when we say subjunctive conditionals, we basically mean anything that starts with if. If this happens, then that. It may be true, it may not. It may have a false antecedent, it may have a true antecedent. It may be, if I were you, X, Y, or Z, false antecedent, or, if I do this particular thing, I can expect a certain outcome already built in. And that would be a true antecedent. So, when we think about God's all-knowing, we need to think about it not just in terms of He knows absolutes, but that He also knows these kinds of conditionals. Now, this is really going to influence what we think about God as it relates to salvation. Because, and I don't want to jump into this too far because we're going to spend a unit on salvation, but what I will say on it here is, and we speak this way a little bit. Maybe take something like what happened yesterday, because Miss Charlotte made the comment this morning that she hoped that because of what happened yesterday, it would drive people to church, it would drive people to faith, right? If I can riff on that for a minute, the idea there would be, in these particular circumstances, this particular person is going to respond this way. Now, if, God forbid, Trump had been assassinated, there would have been a very different reality. The circumstances would be totally different. The context where that person may or may not come to faith even would be totally different, because rather than seeing what all of us understand to be a providential moment where that bullet did not hit him in the head, where it should have, it clipped his ear. I mean, he's going to sort of walk around like... Yeah, he's going to be like Mike Tyson or Evander Holyfield or whoever it is with the ear thing. But, I mean, we all saw that providential moment, and it impacts people in particular ways, and God knows in those particular circumstances Carl is going to respond. Okay? Probably the best way to think about this is in terms of testimonies that you've heard of people. It's another thing that's going around with all of this stuff with Trump is when President Reagan, they tried to assassinate him. And in a journal entry, I'm paraphrasing, but President Reagan said that whenever he was laying there in the hospital, he was trying to breathe, and he realized that he couldn't breathe, and he started praying to God to help him, and then the thought occurred to him, I can't pray to God and have hate in my heart for the mixed up young man who did this. And so I began to pray for him and his soul. Well, that was sort of a recognition of Reagan's circumstances, right? That even though it was a horrific thing that Reagan had been shot, that changed how he thought. Now, if Reagan had not been shot, would he have ever come to that kind of a conclusion? Maybe, maybe not, but in those circumstances he did. And God knew in those circumstances that he would. And so, we can kind of think about, and again, this is big brain thinking, and I won't stay here too long, but we can kind of, imagine any number of possible worlds where things played out differently and the results for individual people were different. Even something as simple as, what if this church had never been built? What would this community look like without this church? What if it was still the old school? I imagine the old school would have fallen in by now. But I mean, what if... I should probably clarify that. Before this building was here, there was the old Kokomo school, and the church moved. It was down the road, and the church moved into the old school and had church in the auditorium. I think it was the auditorium of the old school. So it was very old and very decrepit, and There were some in the community who did not want it to be torn down, and so Brother Glenn, very wisely said, well, I tell you what, you pay for the foundation repairs and we'll fix it. And suddenly they didn't want to pay for those anymore. Conditionals. If you will pay, then we'll leave it alone. God knows what's going to happen in every possible situation, every possible set of circumstances. He knows how people will respond in every kind of those circumstances. And in some ways, when you want to think about this idea of like predestination, that's kind of a way to think about it. That God designed the world with a certain set of circumstances that are going to happen, a certain series of events that are going to happen in all of our lives. And He knows how we're going to respond in those circumstances and in those situations. That's a hard thing, and again, we'll come to it and do more with it at a later point because we need really to talk about Jesus first. But that is just one area where God knows the conditions. Another area, I've used this a lot, but another area would be take Esther. Had Esther not been elevated to power, or maybe not to power, but had she not been elevated to queenship, would the Jews have survived? Maybe. We don't know what the circumstances might have been without Esther that would have allowed for their survival. But God knew that by putting Esther in that position, what Esther would do, how she would react, how Mordecai would react, how Xerxes would react, the whole 9 yards in such a way that the Jews were preserved. And at least the biblical witness in Esther is Mordecai telling Esther, if you don't do this the right way, we're going to get wiped out. So, there's a lot to all of this. The point being, God knew the motion of every tiny little particle that would occur in the history of the universe. He knew our thoughts, or He knows our thoughts before we think them. He knows our free choices before we make them, because He knows what we're going to do. It's a kind of perfect and complete knowledge that I don't think we can ever totally explain, where God knows us so well that He both has our days set out before us, as Jeremiah tells us, and yet He also knows us well enough to know what we're going to do. Like He's able sort of to make that distinction and then factor it all in simultaneously. So it's this, I think, wonderful picture of when we say, God doesn't need plan B. He literally does not need plan B. There is no reactionary bone in God's body, so to speak, using that metaphorically. Please don't say that I said God has a body. He is not trying to negotiate circumstances. The circumstances have already been laid out. But He also knows what would happen in different circumstances. Again, there's another sort of knowledge built into this, and I'll probably just introduce it and then we'll have to finish it next week. But this is, okay, I'll give you some more, sorry. Let's do it this way. Y'all really needed a handout today, didn't you? What we're thinking about in terms of counterfactuals and conditionals is what we might call propositional knowledge. Okay, a proposition being any true statement. That is a proposition. Okay. There is also knowledge. God also has knowledge which is non-propositional. So let's attempt to illustrate this. I'm going to use somebody else's example because they were more creative than I am. This is Dr. William Lane Craig's example. His wife's name is Jan, so you have all the players now. He says, suppose I am visiting Canada and I am chased up a tree by a ferocious moose. While I'm in the tree hanging on for dear life, I say to you, go and tell Jan I've been treed by a moose. What do? You run up to Jan and do you say to her, I've been treed by a moose? No. You would say, Bill has been treed by a moose. So you would communicate to her the information, but you would communicate it by using different words than what he said. Right? It's not you that's in the tree, it's Bill that's in the tree. Okay, you told her Bill has been treed by a moose. In other words, the proposition that you are expressing is the same one because it maintains who is actually being affected and how they're being affected by not saying it's me when clearly it's not you because you're standing there talking to her. So you're maintaining the proposition, but you're using different words to do that. And in that way, everybody in that has propositional knowledge. You have the knowledge that William Craig has been treed by a moose in Canada. Okay, everybody's on the same page about that, but it is communicated differently. I am willing to bet that there is probably some other poor wacko Sunday school teacher who decided to try to teach God's omniscience this morning and is doing it very differently than I am. I hope in God's providence and goodness we're getting the same points across and we're saying the same things about his omniscience, but we're saying it differently. Why? Because we are conditioning the way that we say things relative to who we're trying to communicate to. Okay? So we have the same propositional knowledge, which are these truth statements, but we have different self-knowledge. I am not Tommy. Tommy is not me. I am Ian. He is Tommy. Right? He wouldn't go out and say, I taught about God's omniscience this morning. He would go out and say, Ian fumbled around with God's omniscience this morning. So that self-knowledge is non-propositional. I am me. We don't need anybody to validate that for us, unless we're at Pine Grove or something. But in a normal mind, we understand I am myself. I'm not distinct from myself. I'm not separate from myself. I am Ian. Whatever it means to be Ian, I understand that. That's non-propositional. That is just self-knowledge. It's a true statement, but it's something that is true without being said. Okay? You may never know who I am. It doesn't matter. I'm still me. So even if there was a supercomputer that had all the knowledge in the world, and we're basically getting there with AI, but even if it has all of the propositional knowledge in the world to the degree that people would consider it to be omniscient because it has all of this propositional knowledge, it still couldn't decide to take any sort of real action because it has no self-knowledge. It cannot see itself as distinct from all of these sources where the information is coming from. And because it can't do that, it's not God. God says, I am that I am. God has self-knowledge. God is not, his existence is not conditioned on how he understands the world, or how he understands circumstances, or how he understands individual people. God is. And he knows that he is. He understands himself as a distinct individual. So he has this appropriate self-knowledge of who he is, and he has all true propositional knowledge. So he's, as we think about it, he's more than omniscient. Because not only does he know all truth, but he has this self-knowledge, and he knows has circumstantial knowledge. So I mean, this is beyond just like God knows that I'm going to pick this coffee cup up right now. He knows why I did it more than I know why I did it. He knows the implications of it. He knows what happens in a world where I didn't pick it up. How, to what degree it matters or didn't matter. All of that. When we talk about God's knowledge, all of that is in his mind and more. So this is not, I say God's omniscience is easy. Is it? I don't know. I'm sort of convinced that it's probably not. All right, I'm going to stop, because if I say anything else, I'll need 30 more minutes. I hesitate to ask questions or comments. Is any of this making sense? Okay. Sometimes when I get off and I have to start doing this, I'm like, oh no. Am I front loading all of this well enough? So okay, good. All right, Brother Tommy, will you dismiss us?
Lord,